The Socii were the autonomous tribes and city-states of the Italian Peninsula in permanent military alliance with the Roman Republic until the Social War of 9188 BC. After this conflict, all Rome's peninsular Italian allies were awarded Roman citizenship and the territories incorporated in the Roman state. The Romans themselves referred to the confederates as the Socii Latini, although most were not members of the Latin tribes strictly speaking, but members of various other Italian tribes and city-states. In everyday usage, the word socius could mean associate or partner. In general, the alliance had its origin in the Foedus Cassianum signed by the fledgling Roman Republic with its neighboring Latin city-states shortly after the overthrow of the Roman monarchy in 510 BC. This provided for mutual defense by the two parties on the basis of an equal contribution to the annual military levy, which was probably under Roman overall command. The terms of the treaty were probably more acceptable to the Latins than the previous type of Roman hegemony, that of the Tarquin kings, as the latter had probably required the payment of tribute and not of simple military obligation. The Foedus served as the basic template for Rome's settlement with the large array of tribes and city-states of the whole Italian peninsula that it subjugated during the period 338 to 64 BC. At the start of this period, the original Latins were mostly granted Roman citizenship, but the terms of the Foedus was extended to about 150 other tribes and city-states. When a state was defeated, a part of its territory would be annexed by Rome to provide land for Roman Latin colonists. The latter, although Roman citizens, were required to give up the citizen rights on joining a colony, and accept the status of socii. This was in order that Latin colonies could act as watchdogs on the other socii in the allied military formations. The defeated state would be allowed to keep the rest of its territory in return for binding itself to Rome with a perpetual treaty of military alliance. This would require the ally to have the same friends and enemies as Rome, effectively prohibiting war against other socii and surrendering foreign policy to Rome. Beyond this, the central and in most cases sole obligation on the ally to contribute to the Confederate army on demand. A number of fully equipped troops up to a specified maximum each year to serve under Roman command. The Roman military alliance had fully evolved by 264 BC and remained for 200 years the basis of Roman military organization. From 338 BC to 88 BC, Roman legions were invariably accompanied on campaign by roughly the same numbers of allied troops organized into two units called ally. 75% of a normal consular army's cavalry was supplied by the Italian socii. Although the socii provided around half the levies raised by Rome in any given year, they had no say in how those troops were used. Foreign policy and war were matters exclusively in the hands of the Roman consuls and the Roman Senate. The latter, in turn, was a narrow, self-perpetuating 300-strong clique of wealthy men who monopolized power in the Roman Republic. Despite the theoretical sovereignty of the Roman people, despite the loss of independence and heavy military obligations, the system provided substantial benefits for the socii. Most importantly, they were freed from the constant threat of aggression from the neighbors that had existed in the anarchic centuries prior to the imposition of the Pax Romana. In addition, the Roman alliance protected the Italian peninsula from external invasion, such as the periodic and devastating incursions of Gauls from the Po Valley. Although no longer in control of war and foreign policy, each socius remained otherwise fully autonomous, with its own common laws, system of government, coinage and language. Moreover, the military burden was only half that shouldered by Roman citizens, as the latter numbered only about half the population of the Socii, but provided around half the total levies. Despite this, Allied troops were allowed to share war booty on a 50-50 basis with Romans. Despite these benefits, many Socii rebelled against the alliance whenever the opportunity arose. The best opportunities were provided by the invasions of Italy by the Greek king Pyrrhus in 281-75 BC and by the Carthaginian general Hannibal in 218-03 BC. During these, many Socii joined the invaders, mostly Oscan speakers of southern Italy, most prominently the Samnite tribes, who were Rome's most implacable enemy. At the same time, however, many Socii remained loyal, motivated primarily by antagonisms with neighboring rebels. Even after Rome's disaster at the Battle of Cannae, over half the Socii did not defect, and Rome's military alliance was ultimately victorious. In the century succeeding Hannibal's war, Italy was no longer threatened by external invasion, and Rome and her allies embarked on aggressive expansion overseas, in Spain, Africa and the Balkans. Despite the fact that the alliance was no longer acting defensively, there was virtually no protest from the Socii, most likely because the latter benefited equally in the enormous amounts of war booty yielded by these campaigns. But, beneath the surface, resentment was building among the Socii about the second-class status as peregrini, i.e. non-citizens. The Roman military confederation now became a victim of its own success in forging a united nation out of the patchwork of ethnicities and states. The Socii rebelled en masse, including many that had remained steadfast in the past, launching the so-called social war. But, unlike on previous occasions, their aim was to join the Roman state as equal citizens, not to secede from it. Although the Socii were defeated on the battlefield, they gained the main demand. By the end of the war in 88 BC, all inhabitants of peninsular Italy had been granted the right to apply for Roman citizenship. Meanings of the term Latin. The Romans themselves used the term Latin loosely, and this can be confusing. The term was used to describe what were actually three distinct populations: the Latin tribes, strictly speaking, to which the Romans themselves belonged. These were the inhabitants of Latium Vetus, a small region south of the river Tiber, whose inhabitants were speakers of the Latin language. The inhabitants of Latin colonies. These were colonii made up of mixed Roman, Latin colonists. All the Italian allies of Rome, not only the Latin colonies, but also the other non-Latin allies. In this article, to avoid confusion, only group will be referred to as Latins. Group will be called Latin colonies or colonists, and group will be referred to as Italian confederates. Socii will refer to groups and combined ethnic composition of ancient Italy. The Italian Peninsula at this time was a patchwork of different ethnic groups, languages and cultures. These may be divided into the following broad nations: the Italic tribes, that dominated central and southern Italy. These included the original Latins and a large number of other tribes, most notably the Samnites, who dominated south-central Italy. In addition to Latin, these tribes spoke Umbrian and Oscan dialects, all closely related Indo-European languages. Tribal-based territories of varying size. The Italic tribes were mostly tough hill-dwelling pastoralists, who made superb infantrymen, especially the Samnites. It is believed that the latter invented the manipular infantry formation and the use of javelins and oblong shields, which were adopted by the Romans at the end of the Samnite Wars. An isolated Italic group were the Venetiani. They gave the name to the region they inhabited, Venetia, a name chosen centuries afterwards for the new-founded capital of the allied people of the Venetian lagoon, who would become the most serene Republic of Venice. The Greeks, who had colonized the coastal areas of southern Italy from c. 700 BC onwards, which was known to the Romans as Magna Graecia for that reason. The Greek colonies had the most advanced civilization in the Italian Peninsula, much of which was adopted by the Romans. The language, although Indo-European, was quite different from Latin. City-states with territories. As maritime cities, the Greeks' primary military significance was naval. They invented the best warship of the ancient world, the trireme. Some of the original Greek colonies had been subjugated by the neighboring Italic tribes and become Moscan-speaking in the period up to 264 BC. The surviving Greek cities in 264 BC were all coastal: Neapolis, Poseidonia, Velia, Rhegium, Locri, Croton, Thurii, Heraclea, Metapontum and Tarentum. The most populous were Neapolis, Rhegium and Tarentum, all of which had large strategic harbours on the Tyrrhenian, the Strait of Messina and the Ionian Sea respectively. Tarentum had, until c. 300 BC, been a major power and hegemon of the Italiad League, a confederation of the Greek cities in Italy, but its military capability was crippled by the Romans, who defeated Tarentum by 272 BC. The Etruscans, who dominated the region between the rivers Arno and Tiber, still retaining a derived name today. The Etruscans spoke a non-Indo-European language which today is largely unknown and a distinctive culture. Some scholars believe Rome may have been an Etruscan city at the time of the Roman kings. The Etruscans had originally dominated the Po Valley, but had been progressively displaced from this region by the Gauls in the period 600–400 BC, separating them the Etruscan-speaking regions in the Alpine region. City-states with territories. The Campanians, occupying the fertile plain between the river Volturno and the Bay of Naples. These were not a distinct ethnic group but a mixed Samnite Greek population with Etruscan elements. The Samnites had conquered the Greco-Etruscan city-states in the period 450–400 BC. Speaking the Oscan language, they developed a distinctive culture and identity. Although partly of Samnite blood, they came to regard the mountain Samnites that surrounded them as a major threat, leading them to ask for Roman protection from 340 BC onwards. City-states with territories. As plains dwellers, horses played an important role for the Campanians and their cavalry was considered the best in the peninsula. The main city was Capua, probably the second largest city in Italy at this time. Other important cities were Nola, Aceri, Suessula. The Gauls, who had migrated into and colonized the plain of the Po River from c. 600 BC onwards. This region is now known as Northern Italy, but until the rule of Emperor Augustus was not regarded as part of Italy at all, but part of Gaul. The Romans called it Gallia Cisalpina. They spoke Gaulish dialects, part of the Celtic group of Indo-European languages. Tribal-based territories with some city-like centers. The Ligurians, occupying the region known to the Romans as Liguria, southwest of the Gauls. It is unclear whether the language was non-Indo-European, Italic, or Celtic. Most likely, they spoke a Celto-Italic hybrid language. Tribal-based territories. The Messapi, who occupied the southern part of the Apulian Peninsula, in Italy, believed from inscriptions to be speakers of a tongue related to Illyrian. These were in perpetual conflict over territory with the Greeks of Tarentum. Background: Early Rome. Ancient historians' accounts of the history of Rome before it was destroyed by the Gauls in 386 BC are regarded as highly unreliable by modern historians. Livy, the main surviving ancient source on the early period, himself admits that the pre-386 period is very obscure and that his own account is based on legend rather than written documentation, as the few written documents that did exist in the earlier period were mostly lost in the Gallic fire. There is a tendency among ancient authors to create anachronisms. For example, Rome's so-called Servian Wall was attributed to the legendary king Servius Tullius in c. 550 BC, but archaeology and a note in Livy himself show that the wall was built after the sack of Rome in 386 BC. Servius Tullius was also credited with the centuriate organization of the Roman citizen body, which again scholars agree cannot have been established by Servius in the form described by Livy in Book I. 43. His century were supposedly designed to organize the military levy, but would have resulted in the majority of the total levy being raised from the two top property classes, which were also the smallest numerically, a result that is clearly nonsensical. Instead, the reforms date from much later, certainly after 400 BC and probably after 300 BC. Despite this, the broad trends of early Roman history as related by the ancient authors are reasonably accurate. According to Roman legend, Rome was founded by Romulus in 753 BC. However, the vast amount of archaeological evidence uncovered since the 1970s suggests that Rome did not assume the characteristics of a united city-state before around 625 BC. The same evidence, however, has also conclusively discredited Alfaldi's once fashionable theory that Rome was an insignificant settlement until c. 500 BC. There is now no doubt that Rome was a major city in the period 625–500 BC, when it had an area of c. 285 hectares and an estimated population of 35,000. This made it the second largest in Italy and about half the size of contemporary Athens. Also, few scholars today dispute that Rome was ruled by kings in its archaic period, although whether any of the 7 names of kings preserved by tradition are historical remains uncertain. It is also likely that there were several more kings than those preserved by tradition, given the long duration of the regal era. The Roman monarchy, although an autocracy, did not resemble a medieval monarchy. It was not hereditary and based on divine right but elective and subject to the ultimate sovereignty of the people. The king was elected for life by the People's Assembly, although there is strong evidence that the process was in practice controlled by the patricians, a hereditary aristocratic caste. Most kings were non-Romans brought in from abroad, doubtless as a neutral figure who could be seen as above patrician factions. Although blood relations could succeed, they were still required to submit to election. The position and powers of a Roman king were thus similar to those of Julius Caesar when he was appointed dictator for life in 44 BC, and indeed of the Roman emperors. According to Roman tradition, in 616 BC, an Etruscan named Lucimo from the town of Tarquinii was elected king of Rome as Lucius Tarquinius I. He was succeeded by his son-in-law, Servius Tullius, and then by his son, Lucius Tarquinius II. The establishment of this Etruscan dynasty has led some dated historians to claim that late regal Rome was occupied by troops from Tarquinii, militarily and culturally Etruscanized, but this theory has been dismissed as a myth by Cornell and other more modern historians, who point to the extensive evidence that Rome remained politically independent, as well as linguistically and culturally a Latin city. In relation to the army, the Cornell faction argue that the introduction of heavy infantry in the late regal era followed Greek, not Etruscan, models. In addition, it seems certain that the kings were overthrown in c. 500 BC, probably as a result of a much more complex and bloody revolution than the simple drama of the rape of Lucretia related by Livy, and that they were replaced by some form of collegiate rule. It is likely that the revolution that overthrew the Roman monarchy was engineered by the patrician caste, and that its aim was not, as rationalized later by ancient authors, the establishment of a democracy, but of a patrician-dominated oligarchy. The proverbial arrogance and tyranny of the Tarquins, epitomized by the Lucretia incident, is probably a reflection of the patricians' fear of the Tarquins' growing power and their erosion of patrician privilege, most likely by drawing support from the plebeians. To ensure patrician supremacy, the autocratic power of the kings had to be fragmented and permanently curtailed. Thus, the replacement of a single ruler by a collegiate administration, which soon evolved into two praetors, later called consuls, with equal powers and limited terms of office. In addition, power was further fragmented by the establishment of further collegiate offices, known to history as Roman magistrates. Patrician supremacy was assured by limiting eligibility to hold the republican offices to patricians only. The establishment of a hereditary oligarchy obviously excluded wealthy non-patricians from political power, and it is this class that led plebeian opposition to the early republican settlement. The early republic saw a long and often bitter struggle for political equality, known as the conflict of the orders, against the patrician monopoly of power. The plebeian leadership had the advantage that they represented the vast majority of the population and of their own growing wealth. Milestones in their ultimately successful struggle are the establishment of a plebeian assembly with some legislative power and to elect officers, called tribunes of the plebs, who had the power to veto senatorial decrees, and the opening of the consulship to plebeians. By 338 BC, the privileges of the patricians had become largely ceremonial. But this does not imply a more democratic form of government. The wealthy plebeians who had led the plebeian revolution had no more intention of sharing real power with the poorer and far more numerous fellow plebeians than did the patricians. It was probably at this time that the population was divided, for the purposes of taxation and military service, into 7 classes based on an assessment of the property. The 2 top classes, numerically the smallest, accorded themselves an absolute majority of the votes in the main electoral and legislative assembly. Oligarchy based on birth had been replaced by oligarchy based on wealth. Political organization of the Roman Republic. By c. 300 BC, the Roman Republic had attained its evolved structure, which remained essentially unchanged for 3 centuries. In theory, Rome's republican constitution was democratic, based on the principle of the sovereignty of the Roman people. It had also developed an elaborate set of checks and balances to prevent the excessive concentration of power. The 2 consuls, together with other republican magistrates, were elected annually by the Roman citizenry, voting by centuria at the Comitia Centuriata, held each year on the Field of Mars in Rome. The popular assemblies also had the right to promulgate laws. The consuls, who combined both civil and military functions, had equal authority and the right to veto each other's decisions. The main policy-making institution, the Senate, was an unelected body composed mostly of Roman aristocrats, but its decrees could not contravene leges, and motions in the Senate could be vetoed by any one of 10 tribunes of the plebs, elected by the Concilium Plebis, an assembly restricted to plebeian members only. The tribunes could also veto decisions made by the consuls, but these constitutional arrangements were far less democratic than they might appear, as elections were rigged heavily in favor of the wealthiest echelon of society. The centuriate organization of the Roman citizen body may be summarized as follows. NB and extra 4 centuri were allocated to engineers, trumpeters al, to make a total of 193 centuri. There is a discrepancy in the minimum rating for legionary service between Polybius and Livy. In addition, Polybius states that the proletarii were assigned to naval service while Livy simply states that they were exempt from military service. In both cases, Polybius is to be preferred, as 1,100 drachmae seems too high a figure for destitute individuals, and it is likely that the Roman military would have made use of the manpower of this group. The table shows that the richest two property classes combined, the equites, together with the first property class, were allocated an absolute majority of the votes, despite being a small minority of the population. The precise proportion is unknown, but was most likely under 5% of the citizen body. These classes supplied a legion's cavalry, just 6.6% of the unit's total effectives, which is probably greater than the proportionate share. The lowest class was excluded from legionary service. Overall, votes were allocated in inverse proportion to population. Thus, the lowest social echelon was allocated just one of the 193 centuri, despite being probably the largest. As Livy himself puts it, thus every citizen was given the illusion of wielding power through the right to vote, but in reality the aristocracy remained in full control, for the centuri of knights were summoned first to vote, and then the centuri of the first property class. In the rare event of a majority not being attained, the second class was called, but it was hardly ever necessary to consult the lowest classes. Also, in its legislative capacity, the popular assembly offered little scope for democratic action. For this purpose, the comitia could only meet when summoned by a magistrate. Participants could only vote for or against propositions put before them by the convening magistrate. No amendments or motions from the floor were admissible. In modern terms, the legislative activity of the comitia amounted to no more than a series of referenda, and in no sense resembled the role of a parliament. Further, the period of the Samnite War saw the emergence of the Senate as the predominant political organ at Rome. In the early Republic, the Senate had been an ad hoc advisory council whose members served at the pleasure of the consuls. While no doubt influential as a group of friends and confidants of the consuls, as well as experienced ex-magistrates, the Senate had no formal or independent existence. Power rested with the consuls, acting with the ratification of the comitia, a system described as plebiscitary by Cornell. This situation changed with the Lex Ovinia, which transferred authority to appoint members of the Senate from the consuls to the censes. Two new magistrates elected at 5 yearly intervals, whose specific job was to hold a census of Roman citizens and the property. The Lex Ovinia set specific criteria for such appointments or removals. The result was that the Senate now became a formal constitutional entity. Its members now held office for life, and were thus freed from control by the consuls. In the period following the Lex Ovinia, the consuls were gradually reduced to executive servants of the Senate. The concentration of power in the hands of the Senate is exemplified by its assumption of the power of prorogatio, the extension of the imperium of consuls and other magistrates beyond its single year. It appears that prorogatio could previously be granted only by the comitia e.g. in 326 BC. By the end of the Samnite Wars in 290 BC, the Senate enjoyed complete control over virtually all aspects of political life. finance, war, diplomacy, public order and the state religion. The rise of the Senate's role was the inevitable consequence of the increasing complexity of the Roman state due to its expansion, which made government by short-term officers such as the consuls and by plebiscite impractical. The Senate's monopoly of power in turn entrenched the political supremacy of the wealthiest echelon. The 300 members of the Senate were mostly a narrow, self-perpetuating clique of ex-consuls and other ex-magistrates, virtually all members of the wealthy classes. Within this elite, charismatic personalities, who might challenge senatorial supremacy by allying with the commoners, were neutralized by various devices, such as the virtual abolition of iteration, the re-election of consuls for several successive terms, a practice common before 300 BC. The Roman polity exhibited, in the words of T.J. Cornell, an historian of early Rome, the classic symptoms of oligarchy, a system of government that depends on rotation of office within a competitive elite, and the suppression of charismatic individuals by peer group pressure, usually exercised by a council of elders.